Welcome to the technical deep dive for the Roam42 SmartBlocks. I want to take some time to explore the internals of how SmartBlocks work. This will help those who want to go a little bit deeper into how the engine works. Now, just in the beginning, I'd like to review a few assumptions that you have Roam42 installed. So here's the Roam42 menu. And that you're interested in the technical, the nerdy details of SmartBlocks. This is not really a good introduction to what SmartBlocks are. There's going to be some very good training material available that will cover the very basics and the day-to-day usage. This is more about the nerdy stuff. Now, I'm going to also assume that you know what JavaScript is, but it doesn't mean that you need to know JavaScript, but that you have some basic idea because there's some technical terms and expressions that we'll use and even demonstrate JavaScript. There will be some boring parts because basically it's unscripted and I plan to move around a little bit from topic to topic, so feel free to jump around. But there might be some very interesting nuances, even though it's a little boring to listen to. So, what are SmartBlocks? The best comparison is it's really basically a text expansion or a snippet insertion engine. There are a lot of commercial tools available that allow you to automate keyboard and mouse clicking in your applications. And many Roam users use such tools to automate creating pages or blocks. And that's what Roam42 does. The difference with Roam42 is there's no external dependencies. If you have Roam42 installed, you get basically this text expansion and snippet insertion engine. A lot of these other engines refer to inserting templates. So the word template is appropriate, but you're going to see as we move through Roam42 SmartBlocks that we use the term workflow because we're going to add some smartness, some intelligence to these templates as they get inserted. So a template isn't really quite the right word because a template is a fairly static concept where SmartBlocks is intended to be quite dynamic. So they are not what? SmartBlocks is not a programming language. And as we get into it, you're going to see that SmartBlocks supports commands. These are actions that SmartBlocks can perform, and they look a little bit like a programming language, but at the end, they're not. So for those that have programming background, it's really easy to expect all the concepts of a programming environment, but that's not what this is. And if you don't have programming experience, it can be a little bit intimidating. Don't worry about that because you don't need to be a programmer to use SmartBlocks. You can do very simple template-like things, but you can insert commands that add some intelligence to your work and it won't be complicated. Another thing I want to mention is that SmartBlocks are not always guaranteed to work. Basically, SmartBlocks are currently being developed under the current version 1 alpha Roam API, which is really good, but has a number of limitations, and these limitations significantly impact SmartBlocks. So sometimes the SmartBlock fails until we get a richer API, which Roam is working on. That's just a simple reality. So what you need to do is you need to really test your SmartBlocks for desired results. And that's the thing, if you build them step by step and test thoroughly, then they become quite reliable. The other thing to keep in mind is, like other text expansion tools, don't touch your keyboard or mouse when the SmartBlock is running. Just as with these other tools, they're emulating keyboard entry and mouse clicking. So if you touch your keyboard or remove your mouse, then SmartBlocks will get lost, just as these other engines will. That is also something we'll be able to address in the future with a Roam API version 2, because it'll be possible to insert blocks without having to do all this kind of crazy emulation of the mouse and keyboard. So those are the assumptions. You have some basics. You understand that SmartBlocks is basically for text expansion, emulating keyboard and the mouse, but it is not a programming language, and it doesn't always work, so you need to test thoroughly. Let's discuss the out-of-the-box experience. And what I mean by that, this is a clean database. It has no data in it whatsoever, and the only thing I've done is I've installed Roam42 into it. Now, SmartBlocks is activated through a keyboard trigger. by default, it's 2 semicolons. So just as you type the / to get the Roam menu, you do 2 semicolons, and that pulls up the Roam42 SmartBlocks trigger. By the way, these semicolons can be adjusted, and the Roam42 help discusses that. Now you'll notice that even though this is an empty database, there's already a number of commands that show up. Roam42 ships with a number of very, very simple Roam42 SmartBlocks. So for example, this is for inserting dates. You have today, tomorrow, yesterday, Monday, last Monday, next Monday, and you just start typing. So for example, if I type in the word Monday, notice how the SmartBlocks menu filters the list. So out of all the commands, or I should say out of all the workflows that you have in your database, typing the trigger, 2 semicolons, and then a few letters from the name of the workflow, you'll begin to see the possibilities. So if I want to insert next Monday's date, there it is, there's next Monday. There's also a number of to-do commands, so you can pull back all your to-dos that have today's date in them, or that they're overdue, that are undated, or in the future. This is an empty database, so I don't actually have any to-dos right now to demonstrate. And you'll also see that there's these gear-like things. These are SmartBlock commands, which we'll describe later. So out of the box, you get some basic actions, and these are quite useful. So you're typing some text, and you want Friday's date. That's this Friday, or maybe you want next Friday. And you'll see I actually typed in NF, and it pulled up next Friday. So it's a little bit of an intelligent engine looking at the name of the workflows and then inserts them. So those are the out-of-the-box experience. Let's discuss now the structure of a SmartBlock, basically the basics of what a SmartBlock is. One of the goals with SmartBlocks is to use any possible Roam metaphor as a way of doing our work. So we don't have to invent something new if possible. A SmartBlock needs a special tag that indicates that this block and the subsequent blocks are part of the SmartBlock structure. So that is 42 SmartBlock. So you need that tag. Then is the name of your SmartBlock workflow. So this is what's going to show up in the menu. Let's call it my first SmartBlock. Now, the tag can be at the beginning. Actually, it can be anywhere inside the block. Now, here's the next very important thing. The SmartBlock is made up of all the child blocks of the parent block. So this is the parent block. This is the name of the SmartBlock, the tag that indicates that this is a SmartBlock. And now all the children are a part of this workflow. So block 1, block 2. What does this do? So you see there's my first SmartBlock, and you see there's a little special icon here. This indicates it's a custom workflow. So it's something that you've built in your database, and it's separate from the other workflows. So let's click on that. And as you see, it inserted block 1 and block 2. So it's taking the text from these 2 blocks and it's inserting them there. It's even going to respect indentation. Let's run that again. So you can see it inserted a copy. Now, this first block is not inserted. It's just the definition. It's the parent block, and all the children block get inserted, and they get inserted at the current node level. So let's say I am here. What happens when I run here? My first SmartBlock. It inserts right at that level. So this is basically very similar to other text expansion engines that insert templates. It's very static text, and SmartBlocks is going to reproduce it. Now earlier I mentioned while it's running, it's typing for you and clicking, so you shouldn't do anything. Watch what happens if I type or click while this smart block is running. See how the text is now just randomly dispersed? That's because I moved the focus. You don't want to do that. You start a smart block, let it run to its completion. The other thing you may have noticed, let me run that again. Notice where the cursor ends up. The cursor ends up back in the first block right here at the end. So that's the default behavior. The smart block gets inserted and then returns to the first block and puts the cursor there. And that's where you can start typing. In the beginning, I spoke about the importance of testing your smart blocks, building them one step at a time, testing, and then adding the next step. That's because you want to make sure the logic is going to work the way you think it does in your mind. Let's clean this up. Let's create another smart block. And I'm going to call this SB number 2. And again, my child blocks make it up. So here is block 1. So test it. Yep, that did what I expected. Insert block 2. Test it. Yep, that did what I expected. I want this to be indented. Again, test. Yep, that did what I expected. So one step at a time, testing that it works the way you think it's going to work. If you go up to the website Roam42.com, it's going to reroute you to the Roam Hacker public graph. And here in the sidebar, you'll see the SmartBlock Builder's Guide. And this brings you to the documentation. And there's quite a bit of documentation here. It's an overview of how SmartBlocks works. I'll be linking videos here as they become available, and it gets into the structure and the commands and even advanced usage of SmartBlocks. So it's important to read this documentation, of course not in one sitting, but over time, so that you understand all the capabilities of SmartBlocks. Now, one of the things as you get further along, you're going to want to go beyond just simple text. You're going to want to be able to start using what we call commands. But before I explain what a command is, let me just discuss some terminology you're going to see in the documentation. So a smart block is basically these blocks here. The parent block starts with the tag, pound 42 smart block, and it has to be just like that. The casing, big S, small m, big B, small l, exactly like that, and then the name. It's not important, of course, where the tag is, but it has to be there. And then all the child blocks, these blocks here, make up that smart block. This block here is not a child block, so it is not included. Another important thing to note is that smart blocks can be on any page. There's no rule about where you put your smart blocks, so they can be anywhere that you would like. So far, the smart blocks that we've seen are just simple insertions of text. Now, these text insertions respect indentation, headings, and alignment settings. So you can actually modify those, for example, these heading settings and these alignment settings here. What I wanted to focus on now is the concept of a command. Roam42 Smart Blocks includes over 40 plus commands. And these commands add some smartness, hence the smart block, to this system. And let's start with some very simple examples. Now, for example, if I run this smart block here, which outputs 3 blocks, let's do that. You'll see that my cursor ends up here at number 1. So that's the default behavior. When a smart block is inserted, it inserts all the blocks and then returns to the very first block that's inserted. Now, it could be, though, that you want your cursor to be somewhere else. For example, let's say we want a blank block at the very end, and we want the cursor to be here, not up here. How do we do that? Well, there is a command called cursor. And when I selected that from the SmartBlock menu, you saw that it pops up a little description defines where cursor should be located after the workflow completes. So if we run this now, let's see what happens. You see how the cursor is here at the very end now? We gave it a command where the cursor location should be. And actually you can even get a little more advanced. You might even insert some text but want the cursor to be there at the end. So let's run that now. And here's my cursor. So what is the structure of a command? First, you're going to see the strange little characters here in the front and the back. You basically need the greater sign and the pound and the name of the command. The command is always in uppercase. Always in uppercase, and then it's closed with percentage and then less than. This is the way that you can differentiate from your overall text. This is just regular text that will be inserted. This is a command that the SmartBlocks engine will process. So this is the cursor. Let's say I want the cursor up here after block 2. Let's run that again. And as you can see, my cursor is there now. What if I don't want a cursor to be, I just want to insert the SmartBlock and nothing's in focus? Well, up here on the parent element, I can add a command called no cursor. No cursor. Only use in the 42 SmartBlock definition, so that's the parent. Use to exit out of edit mode after SmartBlock runs. So let's run that now. Whoop, I'm making a mistake here. Let me clean that up. So you can see there's no cursor selected now. That's what the no cursor command does. Now, in addition to commands like cursor and no cursor, you're going to see some commands that look like this one. Let's pull up the date command. And you'll notice here that it has a colon, date colon. And why is that? Because this receives parameters. Notice, returns a Roam formatted date page reference. And parameter 1 is the NLP expression, and 2 is the optional format for returned date. And it gives an example of what that format will look like. NLP stands for Natural Language Processor. Roam42 has a natural language processor that recognizes various English expressions for dates. So let's say we want to say tomorrow. So here's my command, date, all uppercase, colon, and then the first parameter is tomorrow. And you may have noticed in the little pop-up that the second parameter was optional, so we don't need to include it. Let's run this now and see what happens. Oh, that's the wrong SmartBlock. So you see it inserted tomorrow's date. Today is the 26th, tomorrow is the 27th. If I change this to in 2 weeks, January 9th, 2 weeks from now. So that's the natural language processor. I can also add a comma, which means there's going to be a second parameter. Now I'm going to say the format that I want that in. To do that, I insert a comma. That's going to separate the parameters. And now the format. I want it to be the month, the day, and even I want the week number in there. So let's run the SmartBlock. So January, it's a Saturday, and it's week number 2. Let's actually just return the day. There we go, January 6th, week number 2. So how can you know what commands are supported and what the parameters are? If you go to Roam42.com, it redirects you to the Roam Research Roam Hacker public graph, and there on that site, in the sidebar, you'll see the SmartBlocks Builder's Guide. SmartBlock Builder's Guide. If you click on that, it brings you to this page here, and there's quite a bit of help. Now, what is going to interest you is the SmartBlock command reference by category. And by category breaks down the different types of commands available. The alphabetical list is also useful for quickly seeing all the functions or all the commands that are available to you. There's also a very important diagram which we're going to get into, and that is the SmartBlocks command processing order. And this is a visual diagram of all the commands and how they run. I'll describe this in detail in a little bit, but let's find the date command. And here we see the description. So the date command uses Roam42 date natural language processor to return a properly formatted Roam date, and so on. And then the parameters, parameter 1, an expression that will resolve to a date. So for example, today, tomorrow, January 1st, February 1st, some English expression. Number 2 is the format, and there's a link here. You see the link here, which will bring you to the library that we're using for dates. And here you'll get a complete list of all the various commands that are supported for date formatting. So the command reference is very useful for getting into the details of how to use the commands. Now that you have the basic idea of text insertion and what commands are doing, and there's many commands that do many other convenient things for you, I want to get into a little bit about the flow of a workflow. And this might be the most important part of this video because it's going to give you a little insight into the way SmartBlocks thinks. So looking at our example here, we actually see that we have 5 child blocks. The parent block, again, is just a way of saying all child blocks are part of this workflow. And the parent block provides it with some information. There is the name of the smart block, there's the tag that identifies it as a smart block, and as you saw, we can even use some commands, though it's just a very small number of commands in the parent block. The smart block engine will begin to then process one block at a time. So it'll read block 1, it'll output block 1. It'll read block 2, it'll output block 2, and so on. And just to kind of explain what's going on, the SmartBlock engine is going to read all these child blocks, and it's going to read them one by one. So here I'm at block 1. I want to take block 1 and whatever text is there and whatever commands are there, process the commands, and then all the results get put out into the final block. And then it moves to the next block. And there's kind of a sequence of events that it goes through. First, it reads the block, it processes the block, and then it inserts the block. And then as it finishes the block, it reads the next block and moves on and just repeats that cycle. Now, while this is a part of one workflow, all these blocks here, the SmartBlock engine really treats each block as its own entity. It treats them one by one. In other words, it processes block 1, then moves to block 2, but block 2 doesn't really know anything about block 1. When block 2 is done, the engine goes to block 3, it processes block 3, but it doesn't know anything about block 2. So basically, it's a forward-rolling processor. Block 1 is processed, it goes to block 2, and block 2 doesn't really know anything about block 1. It's just a block by itself. It does all its things that it needs to do. The engine goes to block 3, and now block 3 doesn't know anything about block 2. So keep that in mind. Again, it's not a programming language. It is possible to transfer information from block to block. As you'll see a little bit later, there's a way of creating variables, and those variables can be used in future blocks. So in summary, a very important concept is the SmartBlock engine loads all these child blocks, and then block by block it processes them. Block 1, read in, process the commands, output the text. Go to block 2. Process the text in block 2, output block 2, go to block 3. There's no knowledge behind and there's no knowledge going forward unless we've used some variables to transfer knowledge, bridging the blocks together. Now going back here to the Roam42 public graph, roam42.com, there's an interesting diagram there, SmartBlock workflow, command processing order. This is a visual representation of all the commands that are supported in a block. And as I mentioned already, there's over 40 plus commands. These commands run in a specific order. Again, it's not a programming language, it's a command processor. So in other words, it's looking for a command in a block, and it's doing whatever that command requires of it to do, and then it goes to the next command. And the commands follow a specific order as outlined here. So for each block in the workflow, all of these commands are run, or it's looking for these commands and then runs them if they're there. Before the block is actually inserted. So the SmartBlocks engine reads the next block in your workflow, but it hasn't inserted anything yet. It's going to grab that block as a definition of what it needs to do, and then it's going to walk through each of these commands one by one, if they exist in the block definition, and then perform them. So for example, if there's a repeat command, it's going to process the repeat command first. If there is a get command, it's going to do that as the fourth step in the process, and so on. And it just continues to go through the chain of commands until it's finished everything. The reason it's important to know is that you can use multiple commands in one block, but you need to be aware of where it'll be processed. For example, the input command is something we use quite frequently, but the input command runs after the get command. And it actually will make sense to you later why we do that. It's actually a very logical flow. But you need to understand where that runs, because sometimes you think that a command is going to perform something before a different command, but it doesn't. So this is a very useful diagram, and with a little bit of experience, you quickly get a feel for where these commands are performed. And there is a logical order of how they're laid out. Now let's build together a slightly more advanced but useful SmartBlock workflow that will demonstrate a number of these commands. I'm going to call, so let's pull up our tag for a 42 SmartBlock, and I'm going to call this the generate date links for X days. What I want to do is I want to create a SmartBlock that's going to generate a number of blocks for dated pages. So Roam has the concept of a daily notes page. Those are dated pages, and I want to generate some of those links to dated pages in advance. This is a very common thing we do with task or project management. So the first thing I'm interested in is, what is the starting date? So let's pull up the command input. Input prompts the user for input, which will then be inserted into the block. So what we want to ask them is, what is the starting date? Question mark. And then I'm going to use 2 percentage signs, which works as a delimiter, and I can put in a default date. I'm going to say today. Now let's run this and see what happens. So you see the input command with its associated text is, what is the starting date? Defaults to today. When I say OK, notice how today is inserted. So I've actually made a request for information, and that got returned to the block. Let's go further. I'm going to copy this and delete it so we can just focus on the next command. I want to use what's called the set command. Creates a variable in memory. So it expects 2 parameters, a variable name and the value of a variable. So let's call this starting date, comma. So we separated the parameters, and I'm going to paste back in the input here. So what's happening? Roam42 SmartBlocks has the concept of variables, and there's a command called get for getting a variable, and there's a command called set for setting a variable. In this case, we are going to create a variable called start date, and its value is going to be based on the results of input. Now let's run this. Okay, we're familiar with this input and the default text. I say okay. But now you notice there's nothing that appears. Why is that? Well, the input actually got put into this variable. It didn't get output to the block. Let's proceed further. We're going to do basically the same thing. We're going to say the set command, but now we're interested in how many days. What are the X number of days? So how many days, comma, and again, we're going to use input. And here we're going to say how many days to generate. And using the 2 percentage signs, I'm going to default to 5 days. So very similar to the previous block, we get the start date and now how many days. So let's run this. What is the starting date? We could say tomorrow. How many days? 14 days. Again, nothing is output because we're capturing the input into variables. Now, I want to pause here and touch on something really important. As you see, I'm kind of building a block at a time and then testing. Building a block at a time, and even a little more detailed. I'm doing a command at a time, testing, adding another command, testing, then adding a block. It's important to build your smart blocks progressively. It's a little bit of a programming technique to make sure that each block is performing what you expect before we go to the next block. Sometimes people, they have in their mind how the block should work and they just create the entire workflow without testing it, and then something doesn't work early in the process. Well, it's good to test. Let's continue along. Now, what I need is a counter, and I'll explain this a little bit later, but basically we're going to generate a number of links based on the number of days requested from the user. So we need to keep track of what is the block that we've inserted up to the number of days. And to do that, we're going to actually use a little bit of JavaScript. So this is the JavaScript command. I'm going to open a Roam editor for JavaScript and type my code here. And I'm going to use a feature of Roam42 where I can actually save a variable. Now, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you probably recognize what I'm doing here. Let's pause and discuss this for a moment. So one command is called JavaScript, and this allows JavaScript developers to basically do anything they want. It gives them a lot of freedom and a lot of power. But of course, whatever happens in this JavaScript block, the SmartBlock engine doesn't really know what's going on. So while you have a lot of power and you can do a lot of things with the JavaScript command, you also have to be mindful that the SmartBlock engine doesn't really know what you're doing, and you have to be careful. So again, testing, testing, testing. In this case, we're just creating a variable that we're going to use a little bit later. So let's continue along. And now we're going to use a command called datebases. This is a really cool command built into SmartBlocks. It's the time machine. As you've seen, we have support for date-based commands. And today is always the current date of today, but sometimes you want to do things in the future or in the past. For example, let's say you go to a daily notes page next month and you want to run a workflow there, and that workflow is based on that future date, not on today's date. Well, using date basis, you can actually provide it with a description of what is today. So today might actually be a month from now, or a week from now, or tomorrow. You tell the engine what today is, and then all following date commands will be based on what you've said today is. So it allows you to run workflows in the future as if we are already in the future. That's the whole point. Well, what do we want to do here? As you recall, we asked what is the starting date up here. Well, let us now use that variable. So we use the set command to create a variable called start date. Now we want to get that variable here. So we're going to use the get command. And what do we want to get? We want to get the variable called start date. That's the variable name that we've used up here. So that is going to set the date basis. That's going to set the time machine to know how dates should be interpreted. Let's go to the next block. This is where it actually is going to output. Up till now, we've just been capturing information. What is the start date? How many days do you want? We created a counter, and then we set the date basis. Now we want to output results. Well, you'll also recall we asked how many days to generate. So we want to actually take the variable that we set here and use that down here. We are going to use a command called repeat. The repeat command is going to take this entire block and repeat it X number of times. As you can see, it accepts a parameter, and we're going to say get, and we're going to get the variable how many days that we set up here. So repeat how many days up here. And what do we want to repeat? We're going to repeat some text. Let's just test this so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. Generate date links. Question number 1, what is today's starting date? Let's just hit the default today. How many days to generate? 5 is the default. Go. As you can see, nothing got output, but now I recognize I made a mistake here. This should be vars. Let's try it again. Generate today, 5 days, and it started outputting 5 days. So there's 5 blocks of text, undefined. What is that? We'll explain. This is why I say that you need to test, because if you get too far ahead of yourself, something's not going to work, and then you got to go back and figure out what's going on. We don't want these blocks to be output, even though they're outputting as empty, because these commands don't return any results to the block. So we're going to use a command called no block output. This is a special command that basically says process the commands in this block, but don't actually output anything from it. And so we want to repeat that here. We're just gathering information in the second block. Same with the JavaScript. We're not doing anything, so we're going to say no block output. Now, at date basis, we don't actually have to put no block output because this command won't output anything. It's designed specifically just to get the context of the date, the time machine mode, so nothing gets output. So now if I run this again, let's just put in a line so we can see where we're at. Generate, I'll say today, I'll say 5 days. And as you can see, it now output just 5 blocks of text based on the repeat, and no extra blocks got put out because we added the no block output command. Well, we're close. We're very close now. We just need to get our formatted dates. How do we do that? We are going to use the date command. And of course, we have to pass in an NLP expression, a natural language processor expression for a date. And basically what you would say is in X days. Well, the engine isn't going to know what you mean by X. But we'll just run this. If we say in 1 day, to see what happens, generate date links for X days. So we say today, how many days? Let's just create 2. So December 27th. Today is December 26th, and it said in 1 day. Just to prove that the date basis feature is working, let's run this again and say Jan 1. It's a natural language processor, so it recognizes that as January 1st, 2021. Let's say 5. And so January 1st in 1 day is January 2nd. So we see that the time machine mode is working. But this isn't really what we want. We want those days to increment. So let's get into how we'll do that. You'll recall up above we created a day counter, and we need to basically bring that down here and increment it. Well, how can we do that? Well, this is where you need to know a little bit of JavaScript or have a friend who can do it for you. We have some different JavaScript commands here. You see JavaScript as I used up above, but you also have this J colon. This is a shortcut abbreviation to the JavaScript command. It just keeps the command syntax a little bit simpler. And here what we want to do is we want to say return. So this is a JavaScript command, return the following results. We're going to say Roam42 sb.vars, as we did above, day counter. So that's the variable. And now we're going to use the plus equals 1 operator. This is a JavaScript way of saying increment the previous variable by 1. So the repeat command is going to repeat 5 times. And every time it repeats, it's going to increment the day counter by 1. Let us see if this works. Generate date link for X days, today, 5 days, and there we go. From today, it's incrementing 5 days. Let's use the time machine mode. Let's say January 1, and we want to generate 10 days. And as you can see, it's now generating 10 days. Time machine allows us to go back in time. Let's say March 15th, 2020, and we want 8 days. So March 15th and 8 days. So there you've seen a number of commands, including JavaScript for some advanced capabilities. Coming back to the command processing order diagram, you'll see down here below we have something called multi-block commands. Most of these commands just focus on the current block, but the multi-block commands are designed to repeat data. You have different types of commands that might have multiple results, and so we call those multi-block commands. Multi-block commands are a little bit special. In general, they're designed to be the only output for a specific block. In other words, you wouldn't use one of these multi-block commands with these other commands. These other commands are designed to basically process at a block level. These will output multiple results. Multi-block commands are very much like queries. You're not going to get just one block, but likely many blocks. And there's some very cool ones here that require some time to explore and understand. But for example, block mentions allows you to find blocks that mention. They're tagged in a certain way, and you can get back those block mentioned tags. You can also do the same thing for dated tags. There's a generic search multi-block command. This will search every single block in your graph, and if it matches the search parameters, it will return that block. And then there's the set of to-do multi-block commands. So return all the blocks that are due today, return all the blocks that are to-dos but are undated, return overdue blocks, return future blocks, and you also see frequently DNP, which stands for Daily Notes Page, which means these commands also look for to-dos on daily notes pages, even though they may not have a date in them, and treats them as if they had the date in them because they're on a daily notes page. So it gives you a very interesting way to query to-dos from your Roam graph. Let's take a look at how this would actually work. Now, the problem is this is a very simple database. We don't have much data in here, but let's just make up some real test data real quick. So let's call it test 1. We're going to say to read. So that's a type of page that I have. We'll say test 2 to read. And we'll create one more block, test 3, but we'll mark this as already read. Now let's say I want to query this information with a SmartBlock. How would I do that? Let's create a SmartBlock. And we're going to use the block mentions command. And so it returns a list of blocks mentioned. So number 1, the max blocks to return, and 2, page or tag name. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to return anything that mentions to read. how many. We'll say a maximum of 10. We want the tag name to be toRead. And this is case sensitive, just as it's case sensitive up here. So you have to type it in a case sensitive mode. Let's run this and see what happens. As you can see, it returned the 2 blocks from up here, but not this one. Again, any block mentioning toRead up to a number of 10. Let's add a little bit of extra text here, because as you saw, there was also a filtering option. I can return back all the toRead blocks, but as a filter option, only those that say a certain text, like hello. Let's run that again. And now it returned the toRead, but only because it had hello. You can also actually, as a parameter, add minus in front, which means return all toRead blocks that don't have the word hello in it, which is only this one. Now, just to prove to you that this is dynamic, test4 toRead. Let's run this again. And now we got 2 blocks output, 1 and 4. Something to remember about SmartBlocks is they're just outputting the results of the SmartBlock. They're not maintained in the future. So if I add more toRead blocks, they're not just going to magically appear down here. I have to rerun the SmartBlock to get those commands. So this is a multi-block command, which means I can't put other block commands in here because it's going to output multiple blocks. But I can do formatting. So actually what's really interesting is, let's do a block embed. And in this case, we're going to actually pass in the command block mentions. So this isn't rendering anything now, but let's run this and see what happens. So as you can see, it outputted the 2 blocks we expected, but it put them out as embeds. So we can combine these with other standard Roam42 commands. Let's turn our attention now to JavaScript. When SmartBlocks doesn't have a command that you need, this is where you can develop your own commands to do very complex, advanced, and rich things. And in fact, other SmartBlock builders are building JavaScript commands that we can borrow and use in our own SmartBlocks. I want to provide some overview, though, of how JavaScript works in the context of SmartBlocks. And just to emphasize one more time, you really have to test your scenarios because the SmartBlocks engine only knows that it's running JavaScript. It doesn't know what you're doing with the JavaScript. So let's get into some examples. We're going to start off by creating a very simple JavaScript SmartBlock now. I'm going to call this 0 JavaScript test. Now, you're going to see that there's a few JavaScript commands. So for example, JavaScript and J. As I mentioned earlier, J is an abbreviation for JavaScript. So it's a shorthand for the JavaScript command. And it makes our SmartBlocks a little smaller, less verbose. There's also a JavaScript async command. Actually, let me lay these out for you. We'll discuss each of these one by one. There's actually one more command called onBlockExit. These are the 3 JavaScript commands available to you. And if we go back to the Roam42 public graph, we see that in the flow of commands, there's the JavaScript commands, JavaScript and JavaScript async, and then all these other commands get run, and then as we get past all these commands, there is the onBlockExit. So JavaScript and JavaScript async get run very early in the processing of a block, and onBlockExit actually gets processed after the block has already been inserted and just before the engine goes to the next block. Now, why is this important? Many times with JavaScript, you're just trying to manipulate what's going on in the current block, which is fine. But sometimes the block is finished, but you want to do something just before it leaves or to start some other process. for the next block? Well, here you have onBlock exit. OnBlock exit works the same as JavaScript async. So let's describe the two things. JavaScript supports synchronous and synchronous commands. And if you know JavaScript, you'll understand that terminology. But the SmartBlock engine doesn't really know what you're trying to accomplish. So maybe it's a little bit redundant, but we have a few commands that you can use to tell us what you're trying to accomplish. So JavaScript says, hey, I'm just trying to run a simple command, and it's not going to do any remote web calls or do any blocking. It's very useful for simple mathematics, like you saw in the counter example. JavaScript async says you need to stop the processing of the block, let this JavaScript run, and the results that come back use. JavaScript async is what you want to use when you're making web calls to external services. So JavaScript for simple JavaScript commands, JavaScript async when doing complex things like web service or API calls. Let's look at each of these as examples to get an idea about how to properly use them. So let's use JavaScript, and as I mentioned, this is just for simple JavaScript commands. And you can embed the Roam code editor. So let's do that. And now we have a nice little JavaScript block, and we can write our code here. The JavaScript command expects your JavaScript to return some value, and whatever you return will get inserted in the block. So we're going to do something really simple. We're going to use the JavaScript keyword return, which means return this to whoever called me, and we're just going to say hi world, semicolon to finish it. So now when I run this block, hi world. So it's just returning the results here. And of course, we can do other things like JavaScript math. What should that return? 5 plus 5? 10. It's understandable. And you can do other JavaScript commands in here. Var x equals 5 plus 5. Return x. We run that, no surprise. Same results, 10. So that's the basics of using the JavaScript command. And you can do some pretty interesting things with that. For example, perhaps you want the page title. Well, you can walk the HTML DOM to get the page title and to insert that into your block. Those are some of the examples of types of things that you can do. Let's go to another example. And this time, JavaScript async. And let's pull up the JavaScript async command. And let's create a code editor. By the way, you don't have to create the code editor. It just makes it look nice and it's easier to work with. And I'm going to copy some code that I have, and we'll walk through this. Now, async basically means that this needs to be run asynchronously. And this is the way web APIs work. And then it's another way of saying, I'm going to make a call to some remote web service. That remote web service might take a few milliseconds to process my request and return results, or even a few seconds. Well, in the web world, that's really important information. So JavaScript async is a way of telling the SmartBlocks engine, I'm going to make an asynchronous call. And as we're going to see here, I use some of the async await commands to make the remote request and wait for the response and then to return that. So let's walk through this real quick. There's a function called getRandomQuote, and it's marked as async, which is an asynchronous function in JavaScript. And it's going to actually use jQuery's Ajax command, which I kind of like because it kind of avoids some of the issues with cores. That's why I'm using it, even though it's an older command. And it's going to call an API, api.quotable.io/random. This returns a random quote, and actually some really cool quotes. And you'll see it's marked with a wait. This tells JavaScript, run this command, even though it might take a few seconds, and stop doing anything else until it comes back. And then whatever comes back, return it to the caller.
So down here we see var quote equals await get random quote. So in my async function, I'm actually calling this other function I created, and then the results are going to come back in a variable called quote, and I'm going to get content and author, and I'm doing some formatting here so it'll look Roamish. Let's run this. And there's my quote. And so basically this came from a remote web service. It's not a part of my graph, and it's retrieving that data and it's inputting it into my graph. So every time I run this, I'm going to get a different quote. So that is what JavaScript async is. As I mentioned, there's also the onBlock exit, which probably is rarely going to be used, but will be useful for those things that you want to do after the block is inserted and completed and just going on to the next block. The one difference with onBlock exit, the JavaScript and JavaScript commands expect a return value because they're taking that return value and inserting it into the block. OnBlock exit happens after the block is basically completed, so it's not expecting a return result. So you're not going to do anything with it. OnBlock exit might actually be useful for commands that are just sending information to other web services or changing something else in your graph, but don't really require any representation in the current block. I want to show you one more example. This is a JS multi-block command. As you've seen before, whatever you return gets inserted into the block from this JavaScript command. But there might be times where you have multiple blocks that you're trying to return. So what can you do? Let's again do a JavaScript command. And let's create our code editor. And again, I'm going to copy some code that I already have here, and then I'll explain it. So there's a utility function built into the SmartBlocks engine. It's Roam42.smartblocks.activeworkflow.output additional block. If you use this function, it tells the SmartBlock engine to output multiple blocks. So as you can see, I called it once with block 1, I called it a second time with block 2, and I called it again with block 3. And then notice here the return value says this will be ignored. As soon as you use this output additional block function, then the SmartBlock engine knows you're doing a multi-block output and it's not expecting any return results because it's going to output all these blocks here. So let's run this. So as you can see, it output 3 blocks. Just to show you that this is really working, let's make block 4, block 5, and we run this. And there you go. 5 blocks. So in review, you have JavaScript, which is a simple JavaScript function and the returned results will be inserted into the block. You can do asynchronous calls, usually used with web service and API calls. And again, it waits for the async function to finish and will return the result back into the block. And then you can also do multi-block output using this function, output additional blocks, but of course the return value in that scenario is ignored. Coming back to the command processing order diagram, I want to highlight some idiosyncrasies of the engine, some things that can kind of cause confusion, but if you're aware of it ahead of time, will save you some pain. Basically, this entire diagram is being performed for each block in your workflow. So as it says here, for each block in the workflow, this whole command processing thing is happening. But there are individual steps occurring. For example, this shows before blocks are inserted. So all these commands in this big grouping here are happening before a block is inserted. Now, what is a block insert? The workflow starts and it's going to read the first block from your workflow definition, but nothing is yet inserted into Roam. It's just all in memory. And so it's going to run all these commands, and when it reaches the end here, it's actually going to press enter on the keyboard, and that creates a new block in your Roam graph. And then whatever came as a result from these commands and the text that you have in that block get inserted. And then after the insertion, there's some after block inserted commands that run. So these commands usually would be used after a block is completed and it exists in your Roam graph. For example, there's the current block ref command. What that does is it takes the block ref of the current block and will store that into a variable. Well, as I've mentioned, all these commands are run before the block actually exists. So if we ran current block ref somewhere up here, well, the block doesn't exist. So it happens in stages. Each block is processed with this overall process. Step one is before block inserted, all these commands are processed. Number two, the new block is created in your graph and the text that comes from these commands are inserted. And after the insertion, these supplementary commands are run, and then it's done and the process repeats. So it's very useful to visualize the flow of the commands and when they will happen. Now, what can often happen is sometimes somebody uses the no block output command, and basically this stops the block from processing. But they're still expecting, for example, current block ref to run. It won't run. If you call no block output and current block ref in the same command, current block ref is never reached because we've stopped the block from being processed here. So all these commands will run before no block output, but all the remaining commands will not. Second, you'll notice there is an exit command. Exit means exit the SmartBlock workflow. No block output basically means stop this current block. Exit means do everything you can just to stop. And there are some times in your workflow that you reach that point where you don't want it to go any further, so you can call exit and it just, as quickly as it can stop itself, stops. So that's pretty good to keep in mind. You may also notice that there are a few stop commands here. For example, there's the if true command. If true evaluates some condition, and if it's true, it allows the block commands to continue, but if it's false, it'll stop it here. So it could be that at some point you want to test if some condition is true. If it's not true, then the block should not be processed further and it won't be output. That's what if true does. But if it is true, the rest of the block process will continue. You also have the if day of week and if day of month. These commands will look at the day of week or the day of month, and if the condition is true, it'll allow the block to be output. Otherwise, the block is not output. And by the way, if day of week and if day of month supports time machine mode. So if you set the date basis feature, it will be respected by if day of week and if day of month. And by the way, date basis is respected by all these commands. You'll also notice that there are a few if commands. If true up here, and if then or else. Again, SmartBlocks is not a programming language, so we need to understand a little bit your intention. If true basically evaluates a condition and determines if the block will be output. The if, then, and else is designed really more for outputting text in some logical way. So for example, you might have a condition, and if it's true, there's certain text that you want to be output. If it's false, you want different text to be output. So if then and else kind of gives you that ability, but it's not really designed to prevent the block from being output or not. That's what if true is for. It seems a little bit redundant, but it tells the engine your intention. If true means continue or stop the block output. If then or else is more about which text you might want output. Let me demonstrate if day of week and if day of month. Actually, if day of week, that's going to be useful. So we're going to create a smart block. Demonstrate time machine mode. And by default, we're just going to have it return today's date. So using the date command and passing in today, which is the NLP expression. And I'm on December 26th. That's the page for today. What happens if I run demonstrate time machine mode? It puts out the 26th, which is today. Now, if I go to tomorrow's page and I run this command as well, it puts out the 26th because the 26th is today. It's not the 27th yet. Now, if I want it to use the daily note page, here's what I would need to do. Date basis. And here you see it says time machine mode, parameter 1, date basis for date commands. I can type in DNP to use the daily page or an NLP expression. Let's say we want this to be DNP. What we've told it to do is use the date on the daily notes page as the reference point. So if I run this now, today, on December 26th, it puts out the 26th. Let's go to the 27th. What will happen now? Demonstrate. It puts out the 27th. Why? We told the date basis to use the daily notes page, date, as the reference for today. So now, any day I go to, and I run that smart block, just that smart block, this doesn't affect other smart blocks, it's going to use the date of the page as its reference point. So time machine mode, it's actually as if I'm on that future date. Now what happens if I run this on a other page? Let's just pull up a test page and run it now. Well, there's no dated page here, so what's going to happen? It's going to actually use today's date. So DNP only works when I'm actually on the daily notes page itself. Now, let's demonstrate. So just so we remember what that's about. And now we will use the if day of week. And so compares today's date, parameter 1, comma separated list of days of week. 1 is Monday, 7 is Sunday. Example, I can do 1, 3. So let's say I want this block to only show up on Mondays. I type in 1, which represents Monday, and say today is Monday. Now, today is December 26th, which is a Saturday. If I run this command now, you'll see it puts out the reference date, which is good, but nothing here. If I go to Sunday and run it again, same thing, it's not a Monday. If I go to a Monday and run this, today is Monday. So it's using the daily notes page day, and the if day of week function respected that. Now let's go back and take this a step further. If day of week is the Notice how I did 2, 3, 4, all the way to 7. That basically says if it's the second day of the week, the third day of the week, the fourth day of the week, and so on. And now I say today is not Monday. What happens? So I run here. So today is not Monday. I go to the next day, run it again. Of course, today is not Monday, it's a Sunday. I go to the December 28th, which is a Monday. I run it. Oh, today is Monday. So the date basis sets the context of what today's date is. A common request, especially during the beta testing, was, can I call a smart block from within a smart block? The answer is yes, but we call it experimental because the results can be somewhat unpredictable. And it has to do with the fact that we don't have the Roam the Roam API version 2 yet. There are just some things that are very difficult to figure out with what we have at hand. But we basically built it so that a smart block could call a smart block, and you just have to tweak the smart block to get it to output the way you want it to do. But with a little experimentation, you can actually call smart blocks within smart blocks. And my personal daily notes page template has, I think, 10 smart blocks being called from within a master smart block. But it required adjusting each of them until I got the results I wanted. Let me show you quickly what that looks like. Let's call this smart block example 1, and we're just going to have it output hello world. And let's make another smart block called example 2, and it'll say goodbye. So if we run these, no surprise, they're very simple. Okay, so how do I call a smart block from within a smart block? Let's add this here, the smart block command. And the smart block command requires the name of the smart block that you want to run. In this case, it's EX1. And let's run this. Now, this is not going to look so good, but demonstrates the point. So, good, but hello. It's not what we expected. The reason, again, is it was never really designed that a smart block calls a smart block, but it kind of works. And if you know how to tweak it a little bit, for example, I'm pretty confident if I add a blank block here, and this smart block will eat this block, but not the first block. So let's run example 2 again. That's what I wanted. Hello world, goodbye. Just that block gets ignored. So a smart block can call a smart block, but you have to experiment to get the results to be what you want. Let's run it again. Yep, that's what I want. It's looking good. What happens if I run that here after goodbye? Okay, kind of worked, but that's not really what I wanted. What happens if I put a blank block there? That's what I wanted. So you might call this a bug, but it's not really a bug. It's a limitation of where the API sits today, and it's something that we'll fix in the future and actually make quite a bit more robust. But with a little experimentation, you can call a smart block within a smart block. Now, there's something very cool that you can do, and you can create what we call smart block buttons. And actually, in the smart block menu, there is a little helper for building it. It's called the smart block starter for a button. Let's do that. So, what is the name of the caption of the button? Here we're going to put what's going to appear. And by the way, you can't put the word test here. Test doesn't work. This is actually something that Roam doesn't allow, but we're going to just call it example EX2. That is the name of the button. What is the name of the smart block it's going to run? Let's have it call EX1 as a starting point. And so now you see we have a button. And if I click on the button, it actually ran the X1 example. Let us copy the button text and change this to EX2 and click it and see what happens. Good, it ran EX2. So that is creating a button. And there's a lot of other things that you can do with buttons. If you go up to the Roam42 or the Roam Hacker public graph, you'll see alternative methods for running SmartBlocks. And this is where we list the experimental features like the SmartBlock button and the SmartBlock calling SmartBlocks. Little warning if you use the SmartBlocks within SmartBlocks feature. And you can pass in variables, and you can even make a SmartBlock button reappear. In the command processing order workflow diagram, you see here with the multi-block commands, there's also something called a subcommand or subcommand support. Subcommand support for page and path. Subcommand is basically you have certain commands that have related subcommands. So you see here if, then else. If is a command that supports two subcommands, then or else. You don't have to use them. For example, you might just use if and then, or if and else, or use then and else. The multi-block commands also support a set of subcommands called page and path. And I'd like to demonstrate those for you because those are very powerful. So again, it works with these multi-block commands. As you recall, we did multi-block with search. And search was returning results from the to read list. Let's demonstrate what that can do. In this block, let's see, I'm going to press Shift Enter, which creates a soft line break. And now I'm going to put in page. This is the page subcommand, which is designed to work with the multi-block commands, and block mentions is a multi-block mention. So let's run this and see what happens. Actually, just to make it simple, I'm going to get rid of the embed. And let's run it. So what happened? It output the block ref to the to read that matched, but it also put out the page name. Now going a step further, I can actually say output path subcommand, and it's what is the separator between parent blocks. So path walks up the chain of where this block is coming from and lays out the path for you. So we're going to use a space less than sign, and let's run it again. And you'll see it said, I usually like to do this because I also want a separator between the page. So here's the page, and here is where the command is. So this is very useful when the block mentions come from their pages. You can see which page and where in the hierarchy. And actually, let's just demonstrate. So we know that test 1 is going to get returned. Let's just create a blah, blah 2, blah 3, and then indent this there. Let's get rid of the children blocks to not cause any confusion. Run the command again. And so now you see the whole arc structure. It's coming from page December 26th. The first block is multi-block commands. The second block is blah, blah 2, blah 3, and so on. And these are coming back as block references. And because of that, I can easily open them in the sidebar and jump to them. With a live preview enabled in Roam42, or just by pressing Control, the Control key, and hovering over a block, I can actually get a preview of where these paths are along with the block refs. So page and path are very powerful subcommands that can be used in connection with the block mentions, search, and to do multi-block commands. So in summary, what's next? Well, I'm assuming you have Roam42 installed, but you can get it from roam42.com. Definitely check out the SmartBlocks Builder's Guide. It's called the Builder's Guide because it's not a programming language, but you're really building something. You're building a smart workflow. So become a SmartBlock builder. You can also hit us up at on Twitter at the Roam Hacker alias, DM, or just a public tweet. And the best place is on Slack, the roamresearch.slack.com Slack site, and we have a channel there called Roam42. There's a large and strong and active support community there, building SmartBlocks and using other Roam42 features and helping one another out. So those are some places to come and see. So we hope that you'll choose to be a SmartBlock builder, and you can count on our help.